They called me meticulous. For 17 years, I cataloged gene seed tithes in the Apothecarion archives of the Fortress Monastery on Krondis Prime, cross-referencing genetic markers against Legion lineages, verifying purity seals, maintaining the sacred records that proved the Emperor's gene-wrought angels remained uncorrupted. My Magos biologist supervisor commended my devotion to detail. The apothecaries trusted my work without question. I believed I served the Emperor's will with every notation, every seal, every careful inscription in the leather-bound catalogs that stretched back 10,000 years. I believed all of it. My name is Kael Vrost, and I want you to understand something. I was complicit before I was a victim. When I discovered what the Imperium did to the lost legions, when I learned the truth about erasure and reassignment, and the warriors who still fight wearing colors they don't remember choosing, I made a choice that ended my life. But first, I lived long enough to understand the question that haunts me still. What is more cruel than being erased from history? Answer: being erased, but never allowed to die. I began each morning at the 4th bell, when the Fortress Monastery's corridors still held the night's cold, and the scent of burning incense from evening vigils lingered in the recycled air. My workstation occupied a small alcove, an archive chamber secundus, where 17 banks of cogitator terminals hummed beneath vaulted ceilings inscribed with prayers to the Omnissiah. The temperature never varied from 12 degrees Celsius, cold enough to preserve the ancient parchments, cold enough that my breath misted when I spoke the morning litanies. I would begin by offering prayers to the Emperor and the Primarch, then activate my terminal and begin the day's processing. Gene seed tithes arrived weekly from recruiting worlds across the subsector. Each sample required verification against established genetic markers, documentation of extraction protocols, certification of purity, and integration into the Legion's catalog system. The work was sacred. The work was precise. The work was everything. I took pride in my accuracy. In 17 years, I had never filed an incorrect notation. The gene seed of the Astartes represented the Emperor's greatest gift to humanity, the biological legacy of the Primarchs, preserved across 10 millennia through careful stewardship. Every sample I processed represented a future warrior, a defender of mankind, a living embodiment of the Imperium's will. When I logged a tithe from Verdun III, or Talasar, or any of the 100 recruiting worlds that fed the chapter's strength, I was participating in humanity's survival. I ate my daily rations of protein paste and Nutribars with gratitude. I recited the Catechism of Duty during my evening ablutions. I slept soundly in my narrow hab cell, knowing I had served faithfully. The Imperium was vast, yes, and brutal when necessary, but it was also holy. It protected us. It gave purpose to existence. I never questioned this. My supervisor was Magos biologist Hextor Vrain, a woman whose flesh was more augmetic than natural, whose cranial implants hummed softly when she processed data, whose mechadendrites moved with serpentine grace as she reviewed my work. She had served in the archives for 143 years. She remembered gene seed lineages I had never heard of, recited genetic sequences from memory, spoke of the Primarchs with the reverence others reserved for saints. When she reviewed my quarterly performance assessments, she would place one iron-wrought hand on my shoulder and intone through her vox grill that my faith manifested in the precision of my service. I treasured those moments. They confirmed that I mattered, that my small contribution to the Imperium's endless machinery held meaning. I was 37 years old. I expected to serve in the archives until my death, perhaps earning elevation to Junior Magos if I demonstrated sufficient devotion. I expected nothing more. I wanted nothing more. The wrongness began small, so small I nearly missed it. I was processing a gene seed tithe from Octarius Secundus, verifying the genetic markers against the catalog, when I noticed an inconsistency in the reference files. The sample showed genetic drift consistent with 500 years of generational degradation, but the catalog entry dated the lineage's establishment only 320 years prior, a gap of 180 years. I checked twice, assuming input error. The dates remained fixed. I noted the discrepancy in my daily report and continued working. Magos Vrain reviewed it during evening audit. She stood over my workstation for several minutes. Mechadendrites coiled tight against her spine, optical implants clicking and refocusing. Then she marked the entry as corrected without changing anything and told me to purge the observation from my report. The matter was resolved, she said. A cataloging error from decades past. Nothing more. I believed her because I had no reason not to. 3 weeks later, I encountered a second inconsistency, this time in the Vermilion Hawks lineage, a proud gene line that traced its origins to the Unification Wars. The catalog listed 18 distinct genetic markers unique to that lineage. The sample I was processing contained 21 markers, 3 additional sequences, not previously documented, not referenced in any archive notation across 10,000 years of records. I ran the analysis 7 times. The markers were present, stable, integrated into the gene sequence as if they had always existed, but they hadn't. They appeared in samples dated after 445 M39 and never before. I documented this. I prepared a detailed analysis. I submitted it to Magos Vrain with confidence that she would appreciate my thoroughness. She summoned me to her sanctum that evening. The room smelled of machine oil and incense. She did not sit. She stood before me, all 2 meters of augmented frame, and asked me very carefully whether I intended to continue this line of inquiry. I said I only sought to maintain accurate records. She told me the markers were ancient, simply not previously catalogued due to archival damage from an attack in M37. She told me my diligence was noted but unnecessary. She told me to return to standard processing and discontinue anomaly investigation unless specifically instructed. Her optical lenses focused on me with uncomfortable intensity. I agreed. I returned to my workstation, but I didn't stop thinking about those 3 markers that existed and also somehow didn't. The archives extended across 17 subterranean levels beneath the fortress monastery, climate-controlled chambers containing 10 millennia of genetic records, battle honors, recruitment logs, and operational documentation. Most areas remained restricted to personnel of sufficient rank and clearance. I possessed clearance for levels 1 through 4, sufficient for gene seed processing, but insufficient for accessing classified strategic records or pre-heresy documentation. I had never questioned this. I had never needed access beyond my duties. But after the 3rd inconsistency appeared in my work, after I discovered gene markers from the Storm Warden's lineage that shouldn't have existed in samples predating the chapter's official founding, after Magos Vrain grew increasingly terse in her responses to my queries, I found myself wondering what existed in the deeper archives. What records were kept that required such security? What truths about our gene heritage demanded such careful control? I began my investigation quietly, during my meal breaks, using my limited access to cross-reference catalog entries against historical battle records, looking for patterns that might explain the gaps I kept finding. I discovered the first concrete evidence on a rainy evening when the fortress monastery's void shields crackled with atmospheric discharge and the archives hummed with the background radiation of ancient machinery. I was reviewing a recruitment log from 782.M38, cross-referencing it against gene seed tithe records, when I noticed an entry that made no sense. 73 aspirants recruited from Talasar. Genetic screening confirmed compatibility with established lineage markers. Training commenced per standard protocols. But then the notation ended. No graduation record. No assignment to battle companies. No casualty reports. 73 young men simply vanished from documentation after entering training. I checked the next year's recruitment. Another batch missing, and the next. For a 15-year period spanning 782 to M38 to 797 M38, approximately 400 aspirants were recruited, screened, and then ceased to exist in official records. They didn't die. They didn't fail selection. They simply weren't mentioned again, as if someone had carefully extracted every reference to their fate while leaving the recruitment entries intact. I couldn't stop looking. I found similar gaps in records from Octarius Secundus, from Calth, from Nuceria, from a dozen recruiting worlds. Always the same pattern. Aspirants recruited and screened. Training commenced. Then silence. No explanation. No notation. Just absence where presence should have been. And the gaps always occurred during specific time periods, always clustered around particular decades separated by generations, like maintenance schedules, like quotas fulfilled on predetermined timelines, not responses to battlefield casualties or recruitment failures, but calendar entries someone had carefully obscured. I began compiling a private list, dates and numbers recorded in a small notebook I kept in my hab cell. 73 aspirants from Talasar, 51 from Kalth, 88 from Nuxeria. Over 3 years I documented more than 2,000 missing recruitment entries, young men who entered the chapter's service and then vanished from history. The dream started around this time. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would mark them as prophetic or psychically resonant, just recurring images that left me unsettled. I would dream of space marines whose armor bore no heraldry, only bare ceramite painted gray. They fought in battles I didn't recognize, on worlds with names I'd never heard, against enemies that shifted from human to Xenos to demon without consistency. The Marines never spoke. Their faces behind their helms remained blank, featureless. And sometimes, in the dreams, one would turn toward me, and I would feel recognition without understanding why. A sense that I knew them, that we had served together, but the knowledge slipped away when I tried to grasp it. I would wake cold despite my hab cell's regulated temperature, tasting metal, feeling rage at symbols I couldn't name. I mentioned this to no one. I told myself it was stress from overwork. I prayed for the Emperor's guidance. The dreams continued. I began accessing records I wasn't authorized to view. Not through hacking or infiltration, nothing so dramatic. I simply stayed late in the archives after my shift ended, working at my terminal while the night cycle staff assumed I was completing backlog documentation. The security systems tracked presence, but not activity. As long as I remained in my authorized work area, no one questioned what files I accessed. I discovered that gene seed catalog entries included metadata most staff never examined, creation dates for files, modification histories, administrative notations appended by senior staff, and buried in that metadata, I found something that made my hands shake. 17 catalog entries for gene lineages that had been created, stored for decades, and then deleted. Not corrupted, not lost to archival damage. Deliberately removed from the system with administrative authorization. The entries showed genetic markers I didn't recognize, designations that matched no known chapter or legion, reference codes using numerical systems that predated Imperial standard notation, and every deletion carried the same classification marker. Protocol Excision, Authority Sigillite. The Sigillite, Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor during the Unification Wars and Great Crusade. Dead 10,000 years, his authority ended with a heresy. Why would his seal appear on deletion orders from M38 and M39, millennia after his death? Why would gene seed catalog entries require his specific authorization for removal? I tried accessing the deleted files themselves, but they were gone beyond recovery, purged at source code level. Only the metadata ghosts remained, fragments of evidence that something had existed and been unmade. I stared at my terminal screen for an hour that night, watching the deletion records scroll past, 17 lineages that once existed and now didn't. And I felt the first real crack in my certainty. This wasn't archival damage. This wasn't corruption or heresy or invasion destroying records. This was intentional erasure, conducted by the highest levels of Imperial authority, conducted repeatedly across millennia, conducted with such thoroughness that only metadata shadows remained to prove it had ever happened. I continued my work the next day with mechanical precision, processed tithes, verified markers, filed reports. My hands moved through familiar motions, while my mind spiraled through implications I couldn't escape. The Imperium kept secrets. This was known, accepted, necessary. But secrets about gene seed lineages, secrets that required deletion of entire genetic catalogs, Secrets authorized by the sigillite seal long after his death? I couldn't understand the purpose. Gene seed was sacred. The biological legacy of the Primarchs was holy, carefully preserved across 10,000 years precisely because it was irreplaceable. What lineages could have existed that required such complete erasure? What genetic heritage was so dangerous or heretical or compromised that every trace had to be removed? And more disturbing, why did some of the deleted entries date to M38 and M39, centuries after the heresy, suggesting that new lineages had been created and then destroyed in ages that should have been stable, controlled, beyond such chaos? Magos Vrain summoned me to her sanctum 3 days later. I entered to find her standing before a hololith display showing gene sequence data I didn't recognize. She dismissed the display when I approached. Her mechadendrites coiled and uncoiled slowly. A gesture I'd learned meant she was processing something difficult. She asked me directly whether I had been accessing records beyond my authorized scope. I considered lying. I told the truth. I explained the inconsistencies I'd found, the missing recruitment entries, the deleted catalog files, the metadata bearing the sigillite seal. I told her I was trying to understand, to maintain accurate records as my duty required. I told her I meant no disloyalty. She listened without interruption, her augmetic face betraying no reaction. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she told me something I will never forget. "There are 2 legions," she said, her vox grill's tone flat, emotionless, "that do not exist. 2 Primarchs who are not named. They were erased from all official records during the Great Crusade, their gene seed cataloged and sealed, their legions disbanded or absorbed or destroyed. No one below inquisitorial rank knows the truth of what happened to them. I do not know. The apothecaries of this chapter do not know, but their genetic legacy did not end. Gene seed cannot be destroyed, Kael. It can only be repurposed." She showed me a file then, one she said she should not possess, one she had kept secret for 80 years. It contained genetic analysis of samples from across the Imperium, drawn from a dozen different chapters, spanning millennia of gene heritage. And buried in those sequences were markers, fragments of genetic code that matched nothing in known Primarch lineages, but appeared consistently across unrelated chapters, always in low percentages, always distributed without pattern. Orphan markers, genetic sequences with no source attribution, no Primarch designation, existing in the gene pool like archaeological artifacts from a civilization that never was. They seeded the surviving legions. Magos Vrain said, when the lost were erased, their sons were broken up, integrated into other forces, their genetic heritage diluted and distributed, so it could never coalesce again. Some were likely killed, yes, but gene seed is too valuable to waste. The Imperium doesn't destroy resources. It repurposes them. Somewhere in the Imperium's vast armies, there are Astartes, whose genetic origins trace to Primarchs, whose names cannot be spoken. They don't know. They will never know. They fight under colors they didn't choose, for chapters they weren't born to serve, carrying gene heritage from fathers who were unmade. I asked her how she knew this. She told me she had asked the same questions I was asking now, 40 years ago, when she first noticed the inconsistencies. She had investigated quietly, carefully, using her authority as Magos Biologis to access records across the subsector. She had compiled evidence over decades, and she had reached the same conclusion, that the Imperium's official history was a carefully maintained lie, that 2 legions had existed and been erased so completely that only genetic ghosts remained to prove they ever lived. She showed me more files, recruitment records showing aspirants who vanished into training and emerged wearing different chapter colors with no memory of their original selection. Gene seed tithe records indicating samples that were cataloged to one chapter but genetically matched another. Whole companies of Marines whose genetic markers didn't align with their official Primarch lineage, discrepancies so subtle only someone looking would notice. "The missing aspirants you found," she said, "weren't killed. They were reassigned, inducted into kill teams or specialist units or given to chapters that needed reinforcement. Their memories were scrubbed, their identities rewritten, their origins made blank. The Imperium calls it Protocol Excision. It's how they manage genetic heritage that cannot be officially acknowledged. Every few decades, when orphan markers accumulate in the gene pool at concentrations that might be noticed, they cull a recruitment cycle, not out of necessity, out of administrative hygiene. They erase people, Kael, not because those people are heretical or compromised, but because their existence implies questions the Imperium cannot afford to have asked. I couldn't process it. I stood in that sanctum, surrounded by humming machinery and the scent of sanctified oil, and felt reality fracturing around me. This wasn't corruption. This wasn't the work of heretics or traitors operating against imperial doctrine. This was doctrine itself. This was policy, implemented and maintained across 10,000 years by the highest authorities of the Imperium. Gene seed, holy and sacred, treated as a resource to be manipulated, reorganized, selectively erased when convenient. Astartes warriors, the Emperor's finest, subjected to memory scrubbing and identity death to serve administrative purposes, and the scale. If this had been happening since the heresy, if Protocol Excision had been enacted hundreds or thousands of times across millennia, how many warriors had been unmade? How many served now wearing colors they didn't choose, honoring Primarchs who weren't their fathers, fighting battles they didn't remember enlisting for? Magos Vrain gave me access to her private archives that night. I spent 11 hours reviewing her documentation, files she had compiled across 8 decades of quiet investigation. I saw recruitment records from the Dark Angels showing aspirants from Caliban inducted and then transferred to classification pending, without further notation. I saw gene seed tithes from the Space Wolves bearing markers that genetic analysis identified as non-Fenrisian, suggesting outside heritage integrated into their gene pool. I saw battle reports from the Blood Angels describing warriors who exhibited no signs of the Black Rage or Red Thirst, despite possessing confirmed sanguineous lineage. Warriors whose genetic stability seemed impossible given their heritage. Every file pointed to the same truth, that the Imperium had taken the Lost Legion survivors and broken them apart, seeding their genetic material across the Imperium, ensuring that their heritage survived, but their identity did not. The documentation included something else: testimony. Magos Vrain had collected statements from 3 individuals over the decades, people who had encountered evidence similar to mine and investigated. A Munitorum records clerk who noticed casualty reports filed for soldiers who officially never existed. An apothecary who discovered gene seed samples in his chapter's vaults that matched no known Primarch lineage. A remembrancer who found artistic depictions of 21 Primarchs in archives dated before the heresy. All 3 had been silenced. The clerk was executed for accessing classified materials. The apothecary was memory wiped and reassigned to a penal legion. The remembrancer simply vanished from all records, erased as thoroughly as the legions she'd been investigating. And Magos Vrain had documented their fates, preserved their testimony, kept evidence that would likely ensure her own erasure if discovered. She showed me this, knowing what it meant. She was old. She was tired. She had carried this knowledge alone for most of her augmented life. I think part of her was relieved to finally share the burden. I asked her why she never reported her findings to higher authority, why she kept this secret rather than bringing it to the chapter master or Inquisition. She looked at me with eyes that were more lens than flesh and told me something that destroyed my remaining faith. She had reported it. 41 years ago, she had compiled all her evidence and submitted it to the chapter master with a formal request for investigation. He had summoned her to his chambers, reviewed her findings in silence, and then explained very carefully why nothing would be done. The erasure of the Lost Legions was an inquisitorial matter, authorized at the highest levels of imperial governance. The gene seed repurposing was necessary to preserve valuable genetic resources while preventing the reformation of compromised lineages. The memory scrubbing of reassigned Astartes was essential to maintain operational security and prevent psychological fracture in warriors asked to serve under foreign colors. And most importantly, stability. The Imperium's grip on humanity was maintained through absolute certainty, through the appearance of unquestionable truth, admitting that 2 Primarchs had been erased, that legions had been unmade and their sons repurposed, that warriors served unknowingly in violation of their genetic heritage. This would fracture that certainty. It would raise questions about what else the Imperium lied about. It would undermine faith, and faith was the Imperium's foundation. Without it, humanity fractured. Without it, the Imperium fell. The chapter master had told Magos Vrain she was correct in her analysis, but wrong in her conclusion that anything should be done. He had asked her whether she preferred comfortable lies that maintained order or uncomfortable truths that bred chaos. He had told her that he wrestled with these questions every day, that he saw no clear answer, that he chose to maintain the system because someone had to, and he would not pass that burden to another. Then he had sealed her findings under inquisitorial security protocols, forbidden her from discussing them with anyone below his rank, and returned her to archive duty with the understanding that her silence ensured her survival. She had obeyed. She had served for 41 more years, processing gene seed tithes, maintaining the records that sustained the lie. Complicit in the system, she now understood. When I asked her why she was telling me this now, risking both our lives by sharing forbidden knowledge, she said simply that she was dying. Her augmetics were failing, her biological components degrading past Rejuvenat's capacity to restore. She would be dead within months, and she could not die alone with this knowledge, could not let the truth vanish with her. She was passing the burden to me. I left her sanctum at dawn. The fortress monastery was waking, the sounds of morning prayers echoing through corridors, while servitors began their daily maintenance routines. I walked through familiar spaces that felt alien now, surrounded by warriors whose genetic heritage I could no longer trust was what they believed it to be. I saw Astartes in the training cages, practicing combat drills that had been refined across 10,000 years of warfare. I saw chaplains leading devotions in the Reclusium, speaking words of faith in the Emperor and Primarch. I saw tech marines maintaining bolters and armor, treating their war gear with reverence that approached worship. And I wondered how many of them carried orphan markers in their gene seed. How many served chapters they weren't born for. How many honored Primarchs who weren't their genetic fathers. How many had been memory scrubbed, identity killed, turned into weapons without knowledge of what they'd been before. I returned to my workstation and attempted to continue my duties. I processed 3 gene seed tithes before my hand stopped moving. I stared at my terminal screen, at the genetic sequences scrolling past, and couldn't force myself to continue the work. Every sample represented a warrior. Every marker represented heritage, and I was complicit in maintaining the system that had erased, repurposed, and lied about that heritage for 10,000 years. My faith hadn't just cracked. It had shattered completely, leaving only shards sharp enough to cut. I believed the Imperium was necessary. I believed humanity's survival required brutal pragmatism. I believed that in a galaxy of horrors, some moral compromises were inevitable. But this wasn't compromise. This was erasure. This was treating warriors as resources to be cataloged and redistributed without regard for identity, memory, or genetic birthright. This was making the Emperor's sons into tools so completely that they didn't even know they'd been made. I spent the next 3 weeks investigating on my own, driven by something I can only describe as compulsion. I knew the knowledge would change nothing. I knew speaking about it would likely result in my death, but I couldn't stop. I accessed every file my clearance permitted, cross-referenced every genetic sequence I could find, compiled evidence that confirmed what Magos Vrain had shown me. The pattern was undeniable. Orphan markers appeared throughout the Imperium's gene pool, always in low concentrations, always distributed across multiple chapters, always lacking proper source attribution. Recruitment records showed regular cycles of aspirants vanishing from documentation, only to reappear wearing different colors in different chapters. Battle reports described warriors with genetic markers that didn't match their official heritage, discrepancies so subtle that only someone looking for them would notice. And Protocol Excision continued, enacted every few decades, culling recruitment cycles when orphan markers accumulated at noticeable levels. I found documentation of the process itself buried in inquisitorial security protocols I shouldn't have been able to access. When the Imperium identifies Astartes or aspirants bearing problematic genetic markers, they are designated for reassignment, not execution, not exile, reassignment. They are inducted into specialized kill teams or specialist units operating under inquisitorial authority. Their original chapter affiliations severed, their identities declared classified. Then they undergo psycho-indoctrination, memory scrubbing that removes their sense of genetic heritage while preserving combat training and tactical knowledge. When the process completes, they are distributed to chapters requiring reinforcement, inducted under cover identities, told they are survivors of destroyed forces or veterans reassigned for specialized skills. They serve for centuries, fight faithfully, die believing they were always sons of the Primarchs, their armor honors. They never know they were erased. They never know they were repurposed. They never know they serve carrying genetic heritage from fathers whose names cannot be spoken. The cruelty was intentional. I understood that finally. The Imperium could have simply executed warriors bearing Lost Legion markers. Mass culling would have been brutal but honest, final and merciful in its completeness. Instead, they chose this: memory scrubbing, identity death, forced service under foreign colors for causes they didn't remember choosing. And they did it because gene seed was too valuable to waste, because creating new Astartes required decades of training and resources the Imperium couldn't spare, because it was more efficient to erase identity than erase life. The calculation was coldly rational. The implementation was systematic, and it had been maintained for 10,000 years, perfected across millennia, enacted on thousands of warriors who were unmade and rebuilt without ever being told what was done to them. I discovered the psychological studies 3 days before my life ended. They were classified files from the Ordo Astartes, research conducted over centuries examining the effects of memory scrubbing on space marine combat effectiveness. The studies documented everything. Astartes subjected to protocol. Excision showed higher rates of psychological instability than baseline warriors. They experienced unexplained rage at certain symbols or colors. They felt instinctive hatred for brothers they were told they'd always fought beside. They suffered recurring dreams of Primarchs whose faces they couldn't recall. But the instability was manageable. Combat effectiveness remained within acceptable parameters. And most importantly, they continued to serve. The studies concluded that identity death was preferable to physical death when managing genetic heritage that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The psychological toll on individual warriors was acceptable cost for maintaining larger strategic stability. The research was approved and implemented across the Imperium. Thousands of warriors were subjected to the protocol, and the Imperium documented their suffering, analyzed it, determined it was acceptable, and continued. I read those files in my hab cell late at night, surrounded by the small comforts I'd accumulated over 17 years of service. A devotional icon of the Emperor, a prayer scroll blessed by the chapter chaplain, a commendation for faithful service signed by Magos Vrain, all the material evidence of my life in the archives, proof that I had served meaningfully, that I had contributed to something larger than myself. And I understood finally that it was all built on erasure. The Imperium I had served didn't just commit atrocities against its enemies. It committed them against its own warriors, its finest defenders, the gene-wrought sons of the Emperor himself. And it did so not out of necessity born from chaos or corruption, but from cold, administrative logic, because gene seed was valuable, because resources shouldn't be wasted, because maintaining the comfortable lie of imperial perfection mattered more than honoring the warriors who bled for it. Magos Vrain died 6 days later. Her augmetics failed during morning devotions. She collapsed in the reclusium while reciting the litany of the machine, her systems shutting down one by one as biological failure cascaded through her hybrid form. I was summoned to her sanctum to assist with archival transfer, the process of extracting her data uploads and preserving them for integration into the chapter's knowledge banks. I found her private files stored on isolated data cores, clearly marked for destruction upon her death. I copied them before reporting her passing. I knew she had meant for me to have them. I knew she had prepared for this, ensuring her research would survive even if she couldn't. She had carried this burden alone for 8 decades. Now it was mine. The apothecaries came for me 17 hours after Magos Vrain's funeral. I was in my workstation processing a routine gene seed tithe when 2 Astartes in full armor entered Archive Chamber Secundus and requested I accompany them to the chapter master's chambers. Their voices were polite. Their body language suggested this was not optional. I had expected this. I had prepared for it as well as I could. I stood, offered prayers to the Emperor, and followed them through the fortress monastery's corridors to the command sanctum where the chapter master held court. He was an ancient warrior, his armor bearing honor marks from 3 centuries of campaigns, his face marked with scars that rejuvenate couldn't fully erase. He dismissed the guards and spoke to me directly. Magos Vrain compiled forbidden knowledge, he said without preamble. She reported her findings to me 4 decades ago. I sealed them under inquisitorial security protocols and ordered her silence. She obeyed that order faithfully until her death. But she shared her findings with you. We recovered her private files from your terminal. We know what you know, Kael Vrost. Now we must determine what happens to you. I told him I understood. I asked him whether what I had learned was true. He considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He confirmed that 2 legions had been erased during the Great Crusade. Their Primarchs' names stricken from all records, their gene heritage classified beyond even inquisitorial access in most cases. He confirmed that their surviving warriors had been repurposed, broken apart and seeded throughout the Imperium, their genetic markers integrated into existing chapters without official acknowledgement. He confirmed that Protocol Excision continued to operate, culling warriors bearing problematic heritage or redistributing them through memory scrubbing when orphan markers accumulated at noticeable levels. And he confirmed that this was policy, authorized at the highest levels, maintained for 10,000 years. Then he told me why. The Imperium is dying, he said, his voice carrying exhaustion that spanned centuries. It has been dying for 10,000 years, bleeding slowly from wounds that cannot heal. We maintain order through faith, through the appearance of absolute truth, through the certainty that the Emperor's will is law and that law is just. But underneath that certainty is pragmatism so brutal it would shatter most minds to comprehend it fully. The lost legions were erased because their existence threatened stability. I don't know what they did. I don't know whether their Primarchs were traitors or mutants or simply too independent for the Emperor's design. But I know their erasure was deemed necessary. And I know the Imperium does not waste resources, even when erasing history. So their sons were repurposed, memory scrubbed, redistributed. And we continue that practice because gene seed is irreplaceable, and creating new Astartes requires decades the Imperium can rarely spare. Is it cruel? Yes. Is it just? I don't know. I have never known. But someone must be willing to bear this burden, and I will not pass it to another. I asked him whether he slept well carrying that knowledge. He smiled without humor and told me he hadn't slept without nightmares in 200 years. He told me he questioned the decision daily, wrestled with the morality of maintaining a system he recognized was fundamentally unjust, wondered whether there might be better alternatives that simply hadn't been considered. But then he thought about what would happen if the truth emerged. If humanity learned that 2 Primarchs had been erased, that Astartes were subjected to identity death, that the Imperium's genetic heritage was managed through memory scrubbing and forced reassignment. Faith would fracture, chapters would demand investigations, Astartes would question their own genetic origins, the certainty that maintained order would shatter. And in that chaos, in that moment of doubt and questioning, the Imperium's enemies would strike. Humanity would bleed, worlds would burn. The price of truth might be extinction. So I choose the lie, he said. I choose to maintain the system, to enforce protocol Excision, to order warriors into memory scrubbing knowing what it costs them, because the alternative is worse. Or I believe it is. I hope it is. But I cannot know with certainty. No one can. We make our choices in ignorance and live with the consequences. I ask you now to make yours. You can accept what you've learned and return to archive service. You will be monitored, your access restricted, your work audited to ensure you speak of this with no one. You will spend the rest of your life complicit in the system you now understand. Or you can refuse. You can demand justice, demand investigation, demand that truth be made public regardless of cost, and I will have you executed as a threat to Imperial security. Those are your options. Choose. I understood then what he was offering. Not a choice between truth and lies, but between different forms of complicity. Accept the system and live, carrying knowledge that would poison every remaining day of service. Or refuse and die, achieving nothing except the preservation of conscience. There was no good option. There was no path that led to justice or reform or acknowledgement of what had been done to those erased warriors. The system was too vast, too entrenched, too essential to the Imperium's survival to be meaningfully challenged by one data clerk with no authority, no allies, no power to change anything. I sat in that sanctum for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, weighing options that both felt like defeat. The chapter master watched me with eyes that had seen 300 years of impossible choices, waiting patiently for my decision, already knowing what I would say, because he had made the same choice himself 2 centuries ago. I thought about Magos Vrain, who had chosen to live with the knowledge, who had served faithfully for 8 decades while carrying the weight of understanding, who had died without ever speaking the truth beyond her private files. I thought about the 3 investigators whose testimony she had preserved, the clerk and apothecary and remembrancer, who had discovered fragments of the same truth and been silenced for it. I thought about the warriors serving now in chapters across the Imperium, bearing orphan markers they didn't know existed, honoring Primarchs who weren't their genetic fathers, fighting battles they didn't remember choosing to fight. And I thought about what my survival would mean. Years of processing gene seed tithes while knowing they contained markers from erased legions. Decades of maintaining records while understanding they documented systematic erasure. A lifetime of complicity in exchange for the preservation of a life that would be poisoned by what I knew. I told the chapter master I could not serve knowing what I knew. I told him I understood the Imperium's logic, recognized the necessity of maintaining faith, even believed that brutal pragmatism was essential for humanity's survival. But I could not participate in it. I could not catalog gene seed from warriors who had been erased, could not maintain records that documented identity death, could not preserve the comfortable lies that made erasure possible. I told him this wasn't defiance or martyrdom or some grand gesture of resistance. I simply could not make my hands perform the work anymore. The faith that had sustained my service for 17 years was gone, burned away by comprehension, leaving only the ashes of certainty. I asked him to make it quick. He nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his ancient eyes, and told me I would be given time to prepare a final testimony if I wished to leave one. Then he summoned the guards. They took me to a small cell in the fortress monastery's detention block, clean and temperature-controlled, more comfortable than my hab cell had been. They gave me parchment and ink, told me I had 6 hours before execution, and left me alone with my thoughts. I spent the first hour praying, not for salvation or rescue, but for understanding I knew wouldn't come. I prayed to the Emperor, asking whether he had known what his Imperium would become, whether he had foreseen the erasure and repurposing of his sons, whether he would approve of the system that maintained humanity's survival through systematic identity death. I received no answer. I hadn't expected one. Then I began writing this testimony, recording everything I had learned, preserving the evidence Magos Vrain had compiled, documenting the truth about protocol Excision and gene seed repurposing, and the warriors who served wearing colors they didn't choose. I am writing this knowing it will likely be destroyed. The chapter master will review it before my execution, determine it contains forbidden knowledge, and have it sealed or burned to protect Imperial security. But there is a chance, small but real, that someone will read it, that this testimony will survive in some archive, or be copied by some future clerk who encounters the same inconsistencies I found, that the truth will persist despite the Imperium's best efforts to suppress it. I want whoever finds this to understand something. I do not write this to condemn the Imperium. I understand why Protocol Excision exists. I recognize that in a galaxy of horrors, some compromises are necessary for survival. I even believe the chapter master was sincere when he said he didn't know whether his choices were right, that he wrestled with morality daily while continuing to enforce the system. But I also want you to understand the cost. The Lost Legions were erased from history, their Primarchs' names stricken from every record, their genetic heritage classified beyond acknowledgement. But their sons were never allowed the mercy of being forgotten. They were broken apart, memory scrubbed, redistributed across the Imperium to serve in chapters they weren't born for, to honor fathers who weren't theirs, to fight battles they didn't remember choosing. And this continues. Every few decades, when orphan markers accumulate at noticeable levels, the Imperium enacts Protocol Excision. Aspirants vanish from recruitment records. Warriors are designated for reassignment. Identity death is administered systematically, efficiently, with paperwork and authorization codes and administrative precision that makes it feel routine rather than cruel. The Imperium treats its finest warriors as resources to be cataloged and redistributed, their memories and identities less important than the genetic material they carry, their humanity subordinate to the practical necessities of maintaining gene seed supply. The psychological studies I found documented the cost in clinical language. Warriors subjected to Protocol Excision experience unexplained rage at symbols they should not recognize, instinctive hatred for brothers they believe they've always served beside, recurring dreams of Primarchs whose faces they cannot recall. Some develop psychological instabilities that affect combat performance. Some fracture under the weight of identity death, their minds unable to reconcile what they feel with what they've been told to believe. But the studies concluded this was acceptable cost. The warriors remained functional. They continued to fight. They died serving the Imperium just as faithfully as warriors whose identities had never been erased. The efficiency of the system justified its cruelty. The preservation of gene seed resources outweighed the preservation of warrior identity. The pragmatic calculation was made and remade across 10,000 years, each generation of administrators choosing to maintain the protocol, because dismantling it would require acknowledging what had been done, and acknowledgement would shatter faith, and faith was essential to survival. I want you to understand that I am not innocent in this. For 17 years, I processed gene seed tithes, maintained the records that documented erasure, participated in the system that made identity death possible. I filed reports on genetic markers without questioning their origins. I cross-referenced lineages without investigating the inconsistencies I occasionally noticed. I maintained the comfortable certainty that the Imperium was just, that my service was meaningful, that the warriors whose genetic heritage I cataloged were honored by my careful work. I believed because believing was easier than questioning. I served faithfully because faith gave purpose to existence. I was complicit before I became aware, and that complicity stains my soul as deeply as the knowledge that finally broke my faith. The cell's chronometer shows I have 2 hours remaining. I am finishing this testimony with steady hands, no longer afraid, no longer uncertain about my choice. I could have accepted the chapter master's offer to return to archive service, to live another 30 or 40 years in comfortable complicity, processing tithes, and maintaining records while carrying knowledge that poisoned every moment. I could have justified it as necessary, told myself that my individual refusal changed nothing, rationalized that preserving my life served some greater purpose, even if that purpose was only the continuation of existence. Many people make that choice. Most people make that choice. The system depends on it. But I could not. I could not make my hands perform the work anymore. I could not participate in cataloging erasure. I could not be the tool that made identity death routine and administrative and acceptable. So I chose this instead. I am dead now. I have been dead for the duration of reading this testimony. The chapter master will have reviewed my decision, confirmed my refusal to serve, and ordered my execution. It will be quick and efficient. A bolt round to the skull or poison administered with medical precision, my body cremated, and my ashes scattered according to fortress monastery protocols. My name will be removed from archive personnel rosters. My workstation will be reassigned to another clerk who will maintain the records I can no longer touch. My life will leave no mark on the Imperium, except perhaps this testimony, if it survives, if someone finds it, if the truth I've documented persists despite the system's efforts to suppress it. I do not expect martyrdom or remembrance or any dramatic consequence for my choice. I expect silence. I expect erasure of the same kind administered to the lost legions and their sons. I expect to be forgotten as thoroughly as the warriors I've written about. But I made my choice with conscience intact. That matters to me more than survival. I preserved my humanity, even though preserving it cost my life. I refused to become what the system required. Refused to transform into another exhausted administrator maintaining erasure through routine and paperwork and accepted necessity. The chapter master told me he wrestled with morality daily while continuing to enforce protocol Excision, that he didn't know if his choices were right, but someone had to make them. I understand his position. I even sympathize with it. But I cannot be that person. I cannot carry that burden. I cannot live knowing that my hands facilitated identity death, that my careful record-keeping made erasure possible, that my service helped maintain the comfortable lies the Imperium tells itself about the sanctity of gene heritage and the honor of its warriors. The truth I've documented is simple and terrible. 2 legions were erased during the Great Crusade, their Primarchs' names stricken from history, their genetic heritage classified beyond acknowledgement. But their sons were never allowed to die. They were broken apart and redistributed, memory scrubbed and reassigned, forced to serve in chapters they weren't born for while carrying genetic markers from fathers whose names cannot be spoken. And this continues. Protocol Excision operates across the Imperium, enacted every few decades, administered with bureaucratic efficiency that makes horror feel routine. Warriors are designated for reassignment. Identities are erased. Memories are rewritten. And no one speaks about it, because speaking about it would shatter the faith that maintains order, would raise questions about what else the Imperium has erased, would undermine the certainty that humanity's survival depends upon. The Imperium treats its finest warriors as resources. Gene seed is valuable, more valuable than the identities of the warriors who carry it. Creating new Astartes requires decades of training and resources the Imperium can rarely spare. So when warriors bear genetic markers from lost legions, when orphan heritage accumulates in the gene pool, when genetic patterns threaten to reveal truths that cannot be acknowledged, the Imperium repurposes rather than destroys. It scrubs memories rather than ending lives. It preserves biological material while destroying everything that made those warriors individuals. The logic is rational. The implementation is systematic. The cruelty is intentional, not sadistic but pragmatic, calculated to extract maximum utility from warriors who cannot be officially acknowledged. I found psychological studies documenting what this costs the warriors themselves. They dream of Primarchs they cannot name. They feel rage at symbols they should not recognize. They hate brothers they believe they've always served beside. Their identities fracture under the weight of erasure, their minds unable to reconcile what they feel with what they've been told to believe. But they continue fighting. They die faithfully. They serve the Imperium without ever knowing what was done to them, without ever understanding that their memories are lies, that their chapter affiliations are constructs, that their genetic heritage traces to Primarchs who were unmade. The Imperium documents their suffering, analyzes it, determines it is acceptable cost, and continues. 10,000 years of this. 10,000 years of warriors erased and repurposed and forced to fight wearing colors they didn't choose. What is more cruel than being erased from history? Being erased but never allowed to die. Being unmade but kept functional. Your body preserved while your identity is destroyed. Your service maintained while your memory is rewritten. The lost Primarchs were forgotten. Their sons were never allowed to be. They fight still, scattered across the Imperium in chapters that don't know their true heritage, serving faithfully while carrying genetic markers that should not exist, dreaming of fathers they cannot name. They are the orphans of erased legions, the genetic ghosts of warriors who were unmade, the living evidence of the Imperium's pragmatic brutality, and they will never know. The Imperium ensures they will never know. Protocol Excision continues. Memory scrubbing maintains the lie, and faith prevents the questions that might reveal the truth. I want whoever reads this to understand. I do not write to condemn or praise the Imperium. I write to witness, to document what I learned, to preserve testimony that the system will try to erase just as it erased the warriors I've written about. The Imperium maintains humanity's survival through brutal pragmatism. That is true. The galaxy is hostile beyond comprehension. That is also true. Choices must be made that sacrifice some to save many. I accept this. But I also believe that acknowledging what is done, naming the cost, refusing to let erasure be routine and administrative and acceptable, this matters. The warriors who were unmade deserve to be remembered. The aspirants who vanished from recruitment records deserve to have their fates documented. The Astartes, serving now with orphan markers in their gene seed, deserve to know they carry heritage from fathers who were erased. This testimony is my attempt to honor them. Even though I know it will likely fail, even though I know the Imperium will suppress this, just as it suppresses everything else that threatens the comfortable certainty upon which order depends. The chronometer shows 30 minutes remaining. I am finishing this testimony knowing I will not live to see what happens to it. The chapter master may destroy it immediately, may seal it in classified archives, may allow it to survive in some restricted file that no one below inquisitorial rank can access. Or perhaps some clerk in the distant future will encounter the same inconsistencies I've found, will investigate quietly despite the danger, will discover this testimony and understand they are not alone in questioning the system. I hope for that. I hope this document survives to witness that the truth existed, that someone understood what was done to the lost legions and their sons, that the erasure was documented even if it could not be stopped. I made my choice knowing it would change nothing. The Imperium is too vast, too entrenched, too essential to humanity's survival to be meaningfully reformed by one data clerk's refusal to serve. Protocol Excision will continue. Warriors will be memory scrubbed and reassigned. Orphan markers will accumulate and be culled according to predetermined schedules. The system will persist because the alternatives seem worse, because dismantling it would require acknowledging what was done, because faith must be maintained at any cost. I accept this. I do not expect my death to matter strategically or historically or even morally, but it matters to me. I preserved my conscience by refusing complicity. I maintained my humanity by choosing erasure over service, and I documented what I learned so that someday, perhaps, someone else might understand. The guards are at the door now. They are professional, courteous, performing their duty without malice or enthusiasm. They do not know why I am being executed. They do not know what knowledge I carry. They simply follow orders, maintaining the system that maintains humanity. Part of the vast machine that grinds forward through 10,000 years of calculated brutality. I do not blame them. I do not blame the chapter master who ordered my death. I do not even blame the Imperium for creating Protocol Excision, for repurposing the Lost Legion's warriors, for maintaining comfortable lies through systematic erasure. I understand the logic. I recognize the necessity, or what passes for necessity when survival is paramount and mercy is a luxury humanity cannot afford. But I also know the cost. I know what was done to warriors who deserved better. I know the Imperium erases not just histories, but identities, not just records, but memories, not just legions, but the souls of warriors who continue fighting without knowing what they lost. And I know that no pragmatic calculation, no survival imperative, no utilitarian logic can make that acceptable. It can make it necessary. It can make it inevitable. It can make it the least terrible option among alternatives that are worse. But it cannot make it right. And someone must be willing to say that, to witness that, to refuse complicity even when refusal achieves nothing except the preservation of conscience. The door is opening. I am setting down my pen. I am standing to face what comes with dignity intact. My faith shattered, but my humanity preserved. My service ended, but my testimony complete. I do not know if this document will survive. I do not know if anyone will read it. I do not know if the truth I've documented will matter to anyone in the future, or if it will be suppressed as thoroughly as the warriors I've written about. But I know I documented it. I witnessed. I refuse to let erasure be routine and administrative and acceptable. That is all I can do. That is all anyone can do when faced with a system too vast to change and too terrible to accept. My name is Kael Vrost. I served as Senior Data Clerk, Gene Seed Archive Division, Krondis Prime Fortress Monastery for 17 years. I processed tithes, maintained records, cataloged the genetic heritage of warriors who defended humanity across the Imperium. I believed I served faithfully. I believed my work was sacred. I believed the Imperium was just. I was wrong about many things, but I was right about this. Erasure must be witnessed. Identity death must be documented. The warriors who were unmade deserve to be remembered. And someone must be willing to say that the cost of survival, however necessary, is still a cost worth naming. The lost Primarchs were forgotten. Their sons were never allowed to be. They fight still. Orphans of erased legions, carrying genetic heritage from fathers who were unmade, serving in chapters they weren't born for, honoring Primarchs who weren't theirs. They dream of warriors they don't remember being. They feel rage at symbols they shouldn't recognize. They hate brothers they believe they've always served. And they will never know. Protocol Excision ensures they will never know. Memory scrubbing maintains the lie. Faith prevents the questions. The system continues because someone must maintain it, because the alternatives seem worse, because humanity's survival depends on certainties that cannot be questioned. I questioned. I investigated. I documented. I refused. And now I die knowing that my small act of conscience changes nothing except the preservation of my humanity. That is enough. It has to be enough. Because in an Imperium built on erasure and maintained through systematic identity death, the only resistance possible is to refuse complicity, to witness truth even when witnessing achieves nothing, to preserve conscience even when preservation costs everything. If you are reading this, you have found evidence that the Imperium maintains comfortable lies through brutal pragmatism. You have discovered that 2 legions were erased and their warriors repurposed. You have learned that Protocol Excision continues, that memory scrubbing is policy, that gene seed is more valuable than identity. You now carry knowledge that will poison your certainty and compromise your faith. You face the same choice I faced. Accept the system and live complicit, or refuse and face erasure. I cannot tell you which choice is correct. I can only tell you that I chose conscience over survival, that I preserved my humanity by refusing to preserve my life, that witnessing truth mattered to me more than maintaining comfortable lies. The Imperium is dying. It has been dying for 10,000 years. It maintains humanity's survival through calculated cruelty and systematic erasure, through faith that prevents questions and certainty that suppresses doubt. I do not know if this is necessary. I do not know if there are better alternatives that simply haven't been considered. I know only that I could not participate in it, could not make my hands perform the work, could not be the tool that made identity death routine and administrative and acceptable. The lost legions still fight. Their warriors serve across the Imperium, scattered and repurposed and memory scrubbed. They carry orphan markers in their gene seed, dream of Primarchs they cannot name, fight battles they didn't choose while honoring fathers who aren't theirs. They are the evidence of erasure, the genetic ghosts of warriors who were unmade, the living proof that the Imperium's history is a carefully maintained lie, and they will never know. They will die believing they served faithfully, believing they honored their Primarchs truly, believing they preserved their genetic heritage intact. They will die without understanding what was done to them, without knowing they were erased, without recognizing that their identities were destroyed while their bodies were preserved, without comprehending that they were resources first and warriors second, that their memories mattered less than their gene seed, that their humanity was subordinate to administrative necessity. This is the truth the Imperium erases. This is the cost the system maintains. This is what Protocol Excision means when implemented across 10,000 years. Not just the death of legions, but the death of identity itself. Not just the erasure of Primarchs, but the erasure of warriors' souls. Not just the suppression of history, but the suppression of memory and consciousness and self. The Imperium treats its finest defenders as resources to be cataloged and redistributed. Their identities less important than the genetic material they carry. Their humanity expendable in service of larger strategic goals. I documented this knowing documentation changes nothing. I witnessed knowing witness achieves nothing. I refused knowing refusal saves no one. But I made these choices because someone must. Because erasure unchallenged becomes erasure normalized. Because accepting the unacceptable makes monsters of us all. The chapter master told me someone must be willing to bear the burden of maintaining the system. I believe someone must be willing to bear the burden of refusing it. Even when refusal is futile, even when resistance achieves nothing except the preservation of conscience. The lost Primarchs were forgotten so completely that their names cannot be spoken, their deeds cannot be recorded, their existence cannot be acknowledged. But their sons were never allowed that mercy. They fight still, scattered and repurposed and made into weapons without memory. Their genetic heritage preserved while their identities are destroyed. They are the orphans of erased legions. They are the evidence the Imperium cannot fully suppress. They are the truth that persists despite 10,000 years of systematic erasure. And if the Imperium can erase Primarchs, can rewrite Astartes' souls, can force loyalty through annihilation of self, then no hero in the galaxy is safe from being unmade. No warrior is beyond the reach of Protocol Excision. No identity is secure against memory scrubbing. No certainty can be trusted when history itself is subject to administrative revision. This is the final truth I carry to my execution, that the Imperium maintains humanity through the systematic destruction of what makes us human, that survival is purchased through erasure, that the cost of order is the annihilation of self. I am dead now. I have been dead since you began reading this testimony. My name is removed from rosters. My workstation is reassigned. My body is cremated and scattered according to protocols. But this testimony survives if you are reading it. This witness persists if you have found it. This truth endures despite the Imperium's best efforts to suppress it. The lost legions were erased. Their warriors were repurposed. Identity death continues, and someone documented it. Remember them. Remember the warriors who fight without knowing who they are. Remember the aspirants who vanished from records. Remember the Primarchs whose names cannot be spoken. Remember that the Imperium's history is a lie, carefully maintained, systematically enforced, essential to survival, but corrosive to soul. Remember that erasure is policy, that memory scrubbing is routine, that identity death is administrative rather than exceptional. And remember this: refusing complicity, witnessing truth, preserving conscience, these matter even when they change nothing, especially when they change nothing. Because in a galaxy built on erasure, the only resistance possible is to remember, to document, to refuse to let horror become routine, to preserve humanity even when humanity demands we abandon it for survival. The lost Primarchs were forgotten. Their sons were never allowed to be, and I died rather than help maintain that cruelty. That is my testimony. That is my witness. That is my final service to warriors who deserve better than erasure, better than repurposing, better than identity death administered with bureaucratic efficiency across 10,000 years. Remember us, all of us, the erased and the complicit and the witnesses who refused. Remember that we existed, that we mattered, that our choices counted even when they changed nothing. Remember that the Imperium's survival is purchased through systematic cruelty, that its order is maintained through erasure, that its faith is built on lies that must be preserved at any cost. And remember to question, always question, even when questioning achieves nothing, even when doubt is dangerous, even when certainty is easier than truth. Because the moment we stop questioning is the moment we become tools of the system rather than humans serving within it. The moment we accept erasure as routine is the moment we lose what makes resistance possible. The moment we choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths is the moment we sacrifice our humanity for survival. I made my choice. I chose truth over survival, conscience over complicity, humanity over existence. I documented what I learned and died preserving what I witnessed. This testimony is all that remains of my service, my faith, my life. If you have read this far, you carry the same burden I carried. You know what the Imperium does to maintain order. You understand the cost of humanity's survival. You face the same impossible choice. I cannot tell you what to do with this knowledge. I can only tell you that I chose to witness, to document, to refuse. That matters to me. It is all that matters now. The lost Primarchs were forgotten. Their sons were never allowed to be.